we can go now.
Okay, got it. All right, here they come. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our Wednesday night group. We'll let everybody pop on and get settled in and turn on their cameras if they would like to. I'd love to be able to see all of you. I see some familiar faces, some new faces. So we have begun to record, just so you all know, because we would like to be able to share this with others that aren't able to be here tonight. So welcome everyone. For those of you that don't know me, I am Wendy Myers, and I'm one of the senior clinical managers at Cancer Bridges. I'm a licensed clinical social worker, and we're really excited to have you here this evening. This is traditionally our Wednesday night general weekly group. Sometimes we'll have open-ended discussions, and sometimes we have great speakers. And tonight is one of those evenings where we have a great speaker. And I was just sharing with the ladies before you all popped on, I've always wished for a book club. There's so many amazing books that are out there and available, and for us to talk about. So we are going to begin to do this periodically throughout the year and have different authors on. And I'm going to introduce my colleague, who's then going to introduce the person who thought about this idea, and then who will then introduce the person who's going to present tonight. So Jennifer Kem is my colleague and dear friend, and she is our program and development coordinator. Oh my goodness, yes. And at Cancer Bridges. So we're glad to have her here. So go ahead, Jen, take it away.
Well, hello, everyone. We are excited, like Wendy said, and we have our first book in this Meet the Author series is pretty exciting. Dr. Josie, who is here, as well as Dr. Schattner, who's the author, and I had a conversation about a couple months ago, actually, and I was just I was really impressed with what Dr. Schattner's been able to do. Or am I saying your name right? And then just the book in general is amazing, but her story is pretty powerful too. So hopefully you'll feel the same way that I did. I do want to introduce Dr. Van London. Do you want me to read the we'll introduce Dr. Van London, who most of you might know, but she is definitely a friend to Cancer Bridges, and she has been does a number of different support groups, but she is board certified in gerontology and oncology, correct? And that she was the head of the survivorship clinic at Hillman and McGee Women's Hospital for many years, if not like a decade or so, and is just a champion for all cancer patients and survivors. She is also a two-time cancer survivor herself, and has since had to retire due to some health concerns. But she still is very active in helping people. And this is just one small example of that, because she also runs her own group, which we can talk to you about a little bit later. But do you want to introduce Dr. Schattner, Dr. Josie?
Yeah, and I'll start by highlighting this book. This is the book we're going to talk about today, which is written by Dr. Schattner. She is a dear colleague who resides in New York City, and this book is a little thick, and so I know that for some of you it might be hard to work your way through, but I think this book is really nice in how it's set up, and you can choose and pick and select whatever you feel like reading that time. This book describes, in contrast to the history of cancer treatment, it describes how we view and treat cancer in our society, from whispering it way in the beginning to now shouting it off the rooftops through our social media accounts, telling everybody that we have cancer and what we're going through. And Dr. Schattner, has divided his book in different parts. One part is about cancer awakening, which is how somewhere before 1900 through 1960, how the awareness of cancer starts to become awakened. Then I like the titles of these parts. Part 2 is about how cancer is coming out, and that is between 1960 and now. And then there is Cancer's Future is the title, the third part, which includes some essays about how Dr. Schattner sees the future and how there is many things that we can improve upon. She's very hopeful about the future. And I think given her personal history, you will share many of her perspectives. And so without further ado, I would like to give the word to Dr. Schattner, and then she can introduce herself.
Sure. Well, thanks so much for inviting me to participate this evening. Yeah, I should say you can call me Elaine. I am a physician. I'm a clinical associate professor of medicine at Weill Cornell Medical or medicine it's now called. They've changed the name a few times since I began there in 1987 as an intern. And basically, I used to practice oncology, among other things. And unfortunately, one thing Josie and I have, or Dr. Van London have in common is that I had a series of health setbacks, which ultimately led to my stopping practice. One of those was breast cancer, with which I was diagnosed in 2002. And at the time, actually, I didn't think that was such a big deal. I had stage 1 disease, and the breast cancer was found in the context of some other health problems. And as I write in the prologue to my book, I think I underestimated the effects that the treatment would have on me. And also at the time, because I was an oncologist, and I guess I was kind of proud, I didn't reach out to other patients. As I remember when I was in the hospital, I ended up having mastectomy because of spine problems, and basically I had lesions on both sides and needed to reduce weight from my chest. So a mastectomy nurse came to me in the hospital. She was from a group called Reach for Recovery, which was then affiliated with the American Cancer Society. And she said, "Is it okay if we call you?" And I wasn't interested in interacting with other patients. I thought I knew what I needed to know. I knew the statistics. I took some chemotherapy and I tried to move on with my life. Due to other things, I became depressed, and ultimately that's what killed my career. And it was unfortunate because I had recertified, in fact, in hematology, which are blood diseases, and oncology cancer. And I had a practice and a research lab and all this stuff. And I was, in my mid-40s and just reaching success as a professor, if you will, when all these medical problems came one after another. And I stopped and I took some time off. And I went to journalism school. Mm-hmm. So I have a master's in journalism from Columbia, and it's there that I became interested in cancer awareness. And now this really what I realized at the time, and this was around 2008, 2009, was that there was a lot of progress being made against cancer. But in my view, the media, at least what I tended to read, which were generally left-leaning outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, they tended to focus on what was wrong with oncology: high drug prices, the fact that precision medicine, they wrote it rarely worked, that whenever there was a bad oncologist, which is a real problem, they would highlight that, sometimes even on the front page, about doctors taking money from pharma and so forth. And while all of that, I favor transparency, I felt that they were not doing justice to progress, in particular progress in cancer screening and also to new therapeutics. And I became aware, I felt that it was important to look at why people were fatalistic about cancer. Why was there so much negativity about it? And that's really how I engaged with this topic. I believe that there's a perception gap, that many people think cancer can't be treated. Many people fear the treatments more than they fear the disease. And I wanted to understand why people think that way. And so I looked at the history of ideas about cancer in North America and came up with this book. Yeah, and so, so, I share that only because Jen mentioned that she was interested in my story, and I just thought I would get that over with, because really, I don't mind talking about it. That's not what the book is about. The book is about
I know,
advocacy.
but Elaine,
And,
what I like is the parallel between how the cancer perspective of the world has changed, but how you also evolved over time, and how there is a parallel. You've really come to blossom, and I hope you will write much more. But anyway, I'm very proud of you.
well,
I also noted when you were talking, a lot of people here were shaking their head, and they recognized what you were saying. And I don't know if anybody wants to say something or ask something in particular. Abby, I saw her nodding her head several times, but I think there's two Abbies here. So Abby Huret, I don't know how to, I hope I'm not butchering your name, but you were shaking very aggressively, yes.
Well, I have to be honest, I actually know Elaine. I was just typing that into the chat.
Oh, you do?
Well, I think this is, I'll let her tell the story, but my path crossed with her. We're neighbors actually.
No.
But there was a breast cancer group on Twitter, and that's where we crossed paths. And it really is such a great segue to her writing. So that's why I said I'll let her explain that, because her journalism took her from being a fabulous oncologist and then a patient, and then what she's been able to give back to the community. And that's why I was shaking my head. So she's just incredible. I'm so happy that you're having this for her.
well, thank you for saying that, Abby. Yeah, we met on Twitter, so to speak, or the platform formerly known as Twitter, which, yeah. And as I describe in the book, I sort of dove into social media because I perceived a lot of, I noted a lot of anger as people in the, not so much in the 2000s, but after 2010, when social media took off, a lot of people were sharing their stories, and some people say that they were oversharing. I mean, we can talk about that, and I encourage questions about that. You know, it comes up in the book, like, do you have to tell your story? There are people now who feel obligated to, which I think doesn't really, I don't share the view that anyone is compelled to share. It may be useful to share, but there are people who choose not to still. Of course, the people we see who share or hear about in our geographic communities in our neighborhoods, they're the people who choose to share. But there are still people who prefer to not get attention, who fear people's pity, or who still feel shame or stigma about cancer, which is one of the topics that I described from the late 1800s onward, which is a real thing that, and still in other parts of the world, and still in some communities in North America, people feel ashamed of having cancer, or they feel guilty about it, which we could talk about. So I encourage you to ask questions, and I think we should take it from there. I mean, the book encompasses a lot, and I encourage you to read it or read parts of it. There will be an audio version coming out soon. There's a contract out for that. I'm excited. An actor will be reading. I don't know yet who is the actor. Yeah, so that's where I am.
Elaine, I already got a question yesterday from somebody, which corresponds with part one of your book, and you already alluded to it to some degree. And that question touched on two topics. One is shame of having cancer, how it's still there to some degree, but was much worse in the past, and contamination, the fear that somebody with cancer is contagious. And the fear is still there to some degree with some cancers, but much worse in the past. I don't know if you feel comfortable touching a little bit on these two questions.
Yeah, so that's part of why I went back so far in time. So the United States lacked a cancer hospital except for like hospices, basically, until 1883. When a tiny skin and cancer hospital opened in New York City, and then funds were raised to build the New York Cancer Hospital, which didn't open until 1887. And the reason that people wanted to build those hospitals was that there was fear of contagion of cancer in other places, so much so that people with cancer were not admitted to many hospitals because doctors feared that it would infect them or other patients. And the boards of those hospitals feared that, other patients would get infected. And so in particular in New York City, there was a women's hospital that was founded by a sort of infamous doctor, J. Marion Sims, who was a racist, and a lot has been written about Sims in recent years. He was from South Carolina, and anyway, came to New York City and founded the New York Women's Hospital, where people could receive gynecologic care, which at the time was a progressive thing. That hospital opened in 1855, but people with cancer were not permitted to enter that hospital. And after he somehow admitted some people with cancer, he was kicked off the staff of the Women's Hospital in New York. And he met with a group of wealthy New Yorkers, including actually the granddaughter of Alexander Hamilton, and they raised money to build what ultimately became Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Hospital. And the notes on the money needed for that hospital and why it was needed all refer to the fears of contagion. People didn't want to enter a hospital where people had cancer because they thought they might catch it. And there were also ideas that cancer was, caused by God's wrath, basically, or some sort of divine, whatever you believe in, that there was some sort of divine or karma-wise retribution in a cancer diagnosis that people who had cancer deserved. And so there was just people with cancer were not welcome in most hospitals. Some public hospitals did admit cancer patients. But very few. And those were places where people with money did not want to go because hospitals were places of last resort. If a person had means in the 1800s and they needed surgery, they would have it done in their home. To enter a hospital was to basically, submit oneself to who knows what kind of procedures and filth and other problems. And people did not want to be in those institutions, which were a last resort. I think it's really interesting. I describe a book that was published in 1946 with the morbid title, I Die Daily, which was by a woman named Lorna Doone Burke, who was a literary agent. And I described that book also as the grandmother of all cancer blogs. It's just a book where she describes her experiences having cancer, and she ultimately dies from it. And she feels a lot of shame. She's a financial burden to her family. This is in the 1940s. The family sells the car to pay for her care. Her caregiver, who's a colored woman, basically, it turns out has asked her family for money to help pay the bills. And the protagonist, who's the woman with cancer, just feels enormous guilt and shame about being a burden. It's during World War II that she suffers from her cancer. And she says, why should I bother a doctor during war? There are so few men available. That's how it was then. And I don't want to be a burden. I'm not worth their time having cancer. I'm hopeless, which was probably true that there was no remedy, but also she felt this heavy burden of her disease. And that persists in modern times in some communities. I want to just say one other thing about infection and cancer, which is really interesting, because we know now that some cancers are caused by infection. That's not to say that the cancers are contagious, but the human papillomavirus, the Epstein-Barr virus, hepatitis C and hepatitis B, and some other infections are causative agents in some cancers. So, there was a kernel of truth in some aspects of the concern about cancer being contagious. The gist of it was wrong, but it is true that some cancers are caused by infectious elements, if you will.
Yes, thank you, Elaine. Is somebody starting to talk or? No.
I could raise one point that has to do with Pittsburgh, just two things, if you will.
Yeah,
because
yeah, that's a good point.
Based in Pittsburgh. First, I just while we were preparing a few minutes ago, on one of the early cancer groups was in Pittsburgh, and one of the earliest public cancer meetings took place in Pittsburgh. I don't know if you can see this Pittsburgh Post article, but that's the front page from February of 1914. Yeah, so there was this group which I described. People say that no one talked about cancer, but actually in the progressive era, around starting in 1913, a group of physicians and socialites, if you will, decided to try and educate the public, and particularly women, about cancer. And they formed this society, which ultimately became the American Cancer Society. Anyway, they held public meetings about cancer in theater in New York City, in a women's club, the Cosmopolitan Club, where Mrs. Richard Aldrich, as she was called, basically moderated a panel between two physicians. And the men argued about what was the best cancer treatment, and she led the meeting. Anyway, in Pittsburgh, they had a meeting at Soldiers Memorial Hall, and it was supposedly attended by hundreds, if not thousands, of people. And then they also had meetings in Pittsburgh's in a women's club and in the Pittsburgh Medical Society. These were meetings about cancer to educate the public, and the idea was that people were fatalistic about cancer. They feared going for surgery. They feared going to physicians. And so by the time they might go to a doctor to have, say, a lump removed, it would be too late. So the idea of the society was to encourage people to not be afraid of doctors and surgeons in particular, because that surgery could be curative. And so they went to publicize this. They went to Pittsburgh, among other cities. I should say that I think there was a little bit of the cart before the horse in that in fact, very few tumors could be treated effectively in 1914. And so I think some of the resistance to current, publicity about cancer's curability in some cases, not in all, don't get me wrong, many cases still unfortunately cannot be treated, but for the idea of early detection and cancer's treatability, I think people in their hearts still fear the disease and really question its treatability based on how much publicity there was prematurely in the 20th century. I see there's a question. Shall I answer that? Jen, from Rod. Hi, Rod. Yeah.
Hi, Elaine.
How useful do I think social media is in cancer education? That's a great question. Yeah, some people think I should have just written the book on social media. Yeah, and the problem with part of what took me so long to write the book was that just kept, it was a moving target and an exploding, expanding target. As I was writing, there were new platforms. I mean, for a while I started looking at Reddit and threads on Reddit, and I just thought I cannot go there, so I focused on Twitter and on Facebook a little bit because those are what I knew. But the fact is there are many platforms on which people talk about cancer. And I think social media is crucial in several ways. So first, there's the way that people can connect one with another. And that includes people who have cancer, people who are caregivers, people who are just interested or worried. As I write in the book, there are risks because people may be exposed on social media in ways they don't realize. When patients go online and share their diagnoses, if they do so, a lot of people are taking notes, and those include journalists who are looking for sources. I've seen that a lot. I mean, it's kind of weird, and how much social media is used to connect journalists with sources. So the journalists don't really hear much from patients who are quieter or people who are quieter and not participating in some platforms. There are also drug companies that monitor social media for patients reporting side effects from drugs. Biotech investors, that's a thing. I've been asked about it at a number of talks where I've given in person. Like they're actually monitoring Facebook pages for people, say, as you know now, there are Facebook pages for people who have very particular cancer forms and treatments. If you're on a particular drug, you can probably find a Facebook group for that. If you've had a bone marrow transplant, whatever you have, there are pages, groups, and people monitoring those. Yeah, and then there are also people who lie about having cancer for various reasons, which I discuss, sometimes financial, sometimes just weird ego things or fetishisms. And, it can be very confusing. Overall, though, I think that social media is a positive thing because people are not isolated as they were. So I live in New York City, and it's pretty easy to find people if I want to, but with similar conditions. But I think for people in isolated communities, in rural communities, in some countries where people are less open about cancer, social media is a godsend. It really enables people to connect, but I think they have to do so carefully. As far as education about cancer, obviously social media can be invaluable, and a lot of doctors are on social media nominally for the purpose of education. Unfortunately, I think a lot are there for promotion of their research. They too are looking for potential research subjects. They go online and they're sharing all the stuff, but actually, if you look at what they're doing, they're promoting their articles, or they've got trials going on, and they kind of let it be known that they have trials for triple negative breast cancer or, ALK positive lung cancer, whatever. And so those connections are useful. I mean, it may be helpful to patients to connect with doctors online who have those research projects ongoing, but the doctors don't always say what their purpose is online. I'm wary of everyone, and I think an informed patient should be. So, Rod, in answer to your question, I think social media is invaluable, but there's, it's complicated. Also, there's a lot of misinformation, and as we've seen in the past, 10 years, doctors are, the past 3 years, we've seen doctors argue a lot about COVID. Everyone sees that and knows that, and what even very basic things, about vaccines, masks. But with cancer drugs, I used to argue with some doctors about the value of cancer screening and certain cancer drugs. And I mean, I think those arguments didn't serve me, in part because I'm a woman and people don't like when women argue, and, but also I learned that just there are people who are very dogmatic and have different opinions out there. And I think, you can find a doctor who will tell you to go, that cancer drugs are bad, or that precision oncology doesn't work. And they may have their reasons for believing that. And I think it's very, very hard for any platform to gauge what's valid, because doctors argue among themselves. And to a large extent, the arguments are with reason. I mean, I don't want to, I think there are some things that are clearly wrong, and I don't want to go there today, but data from medical studies can be interpreted variously, the same way you get different opinions. Did doctors interpret things different ways? I know that from my prior experience, and I know that as a patient. And it's worth sort of being aware of disagreements within the medical community, which now people, I think, see more and are more aware of, which is probably a good thing that people recognize that.
I think somebody writes something. But I think, Elaine, what you bring up, maybe what we can tie in here is the pendulum. That now there's so much shouting happening, if that's how you want to call the social media activity, that it's almost too much. And the pendulum has shifted from whispering to so far to shouting. How do we regulate that? Will it ever be landing somewhere in the middle? How do we go about that. I think, by the way, you have many more books to write because there's a lot in your head there. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this pendulum. Do you know, on the one hand, it's good that there's so much out there and that all of us should not stick with following one person and listening to them and following their orders, but we should always sample multiple people, multiple sources, so that we have the ability to make an informed consent. But just to pinpoint on this pendulum, are we overshooting a little bit? Where do you feel it goes moving forwards, Elaine? That's a little bit of a philosophical question.
Sure. Well, as you say, I describe how patients' voices have become louder. And that's actually, I think, the greatest theme of my book, which is how used to be, and that reflects on the interaction between science and patient advocacy. It used to be that very few people survived cancer for, maybe that people weren't diagnosed, but once people were known to have cancer 100 years ago, 90+% died within 3 years. And I'm not exaggerating. I mean, when I looked at the old papers, even with breast cancer, which we consider highly treatable in most cases, the overwhelming majority of patients died. In fact, into the 1960s, 1/3 of patients with breast cancer died within 5 years. Colon cancer, it was 50-50, any stage up until the 1980s. We don't realize how morbid cancer was until modern times. And so what happened was, as people started surviving cancer more, they were able to talk more and tell about their experiences and share those experiences. So in the 50s and 60s, because more people, breast cancer was the most commonly survived cancer, and women were generally more willing to talk about their experiences with cancer than men. You heard about people having breast cancer, just a few, and those tended to be people who were editors at magazines because they had a platform. There was no way, you couldn't just post to social media your experience with cancer or your feelings. And they were book authors, and they were celebrities who had cancer who occasionally were given voice. And gradually, through the internet, and I go through the early days of the web in the 90s when there were chat rooms and early blogs, and people started sharing. There was someone named Grandma Barb or something with chronic lymphocytic leukemia. There was a chat room for people who had multiple myeloma, which was, by the way, incurable in the 1990s when I was practicing, and median survival was under 3 years. Now people are living for many years with multiple myeloma. But the point is, as they started surviving, people started speaking out more and more. And as more people spoke out, more people became comfortable speaking out. So, breast cancer sort of led the way with awareness, but then in the 90s, some men started speaking out about having prostate cancer. And then gradually, with thanks to Katie Couric and others, in the 2000s, you have more colon cancer discussions. If you look, I think it's kind of interesting and telling that with pancreatic cancer or liver cancer, you didn't hear a lot about it, and then that's in part because very few people survived it, at least in our Western culture, and who are English speakers that we would hear from. So gradually, there was sort of this explosion of people admitting their own cases of cancer, telling their stories, and the web then and social media enabled just almost anyone who wanted to speak about having cancer to do so, to share their pictures, to share their stories, to share their feelings, their experiences, to ask questions. And my impression 10 years ago, and this is part of what motivated me to write the book, is that there was a lot of anger toward at least breast cancer patients. And that's in part because some people thought that, breast cancer was represented as a good cancer, which of course there's no good cancer. It's not a contest. It is true that there was a lot of awareness about breast cancer, and that there was a lot of attention, I think perhaps disproportionately, to breast cancer. And that caused frustration. And actually, as I described, even competition among cancer organizations and other patient advocacy groups. And that's sort of an ugly side of it. I think also then people, a few cases of misrepresentation and outright lies. There's something called Munchausen's by internet, where people fabricate having cancer and then generate sympathy or funds, and that causes resentment. There were a lot of issues which I think were unfortunate for people who were affected by cancer, because this happened just as so many good therapies were becoming available. And I felt that I wanted to sort of look into that anger and understand it. And I think, people, as you know, on the internet, people are just angry. I think that there are a lot of problems in our society, not just cancer. And, here, if you have people saying, I need more research, I need more support for my treatment, there are people who just shut that off. Also, as more people spoke, I think people began to tire of it. And that's really unfortunate. And that's a sort of controversial thing I describe in chapter 14, which is has awareness backfired. Because I think, whereas say when Love Story came out, or when Terms of Endearment, when I was in med school, came out, those movies, cancer was a tragedy. The protagonist died, everyone was sympathetic, and the reason it was a tragedy is there were very few treatments. And now that we have all these great treatments available, or at least that might benefit some patients, people are feeling that it's too expensive, that it's too costly, that there are other problems, and so forth. And so I think my own opinion is that there's nothing, that awareness is a constructive force. And I think it's great that people should feel comfortable talking about cancer, that we need that for people to seek the care they need, to not be ashamed, that, like, think of mental health or other conditions. The more people are open about their needs, the more likely they are to have those needs met. That said, I think we have to be cognizant of other conditions. There are people with ALS, there are people with severe diabetes, there are people with other conditions, epilepsy. I mean, I could name heart disease, all of which are attention worthy. So I think, as the internet has essentially splintered cancer groups, and at some level even turned some against one another. That's unfortunate, because I think we all would benefit from compassionate care and knowledge, awareness of new treatments and the limitations of those treatments, and also compassion for one another. I think, we have to have, be kind to one another and help one another as we can. So my feelings on this are very mixed. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes.
The light changed outside, and there was a lot of natural light when we started, and I just want to turn on a light so it's less dark where I am. Just excuse me for 1 second.
That's okay. Maybe we're halfway through, sort of. I wanted to ask if there's anybody who has any other questions, if you want to type it or talk.
Oh, I see a question about AI from Abby Hewitt. Shall I answer that?
Yeah, that's fine. It's a good
So
question. It's about
Abby
artificial
also,
intelligence.
all right, thank you for that question. Abby, also thank you for your kind words earlier. You said something really nice in the comments. Yeah, so I think AI is a really important and potentially useful tool for patients and doctors. And so, yeah, I'm a little scared of it, and there are biases with automation, and all that is true. That said, I really am a believer in precision oncology. When I was practicing, right, we would give people transplants where we would, irradiate the bone marrow and give them very high doses of chemotherapy, and just basically blast their whole body with toxins, and then hope that we would kill the cancer and not them. And those were very harsh treatments. Chemotherapy in general is not, the traditional chemotherapies are not designed to kill cancer cells particularly. They knock out, they have toxic effects on the heart, the liver. I don't need to tell this audience how toxic chemotherapy can be. The idea of precision oncology is to target the tumor and not the body. So the more that we learn about molecules, like genetic changes that are particular to the tumor cells, or are genetic changes, those that are, usually mutations, but not always, in the tumors. It can be that a gene is amplified in the tumor. Also, sometimes there's too much of a protein in the tumor compared to normal. If we can target those aberrations, then basically you can kill the tumor disproportionately compared to the rest of the body. Either way, with traditional chemo or with novel treatments, I think that we have the potential to know basically how everybody is doing in cancer land, if you will. So if you enter a modern cancer hospital, I'll say Memorial Sloan Kettering because I know it, or Dana-Farber, I don't know the details at Pittsburgh. You have an excellent cancer center, I can tell you that much, but almost all of the major cancer centers have essentially deals with molecular pathology companies. And the moment you go into those hospitals, essentially, you may not realize it, but your stuff, your data, your life, your molecular details are sold. Okay. And those companies separately, unfortunately, are analyzing your treatments and your molecules and your cells and how those things change over time and how you do as a cancer patient. And so in my mind, the same way, like, Netflix knows what movie you might like and Amazon knows what books you might want to read, these companies, if the data weren't siloed and if the data were all analyzed properly, they could tell you if you have such a mutation and such a protein and it's in your brain and your liver and whatever, what treatments you've had, what's the best drug for you now. And there's no way a human doctor can know that, even an oncologist, because there's so many drugs available now, new drugs that, it's very confusing to patients having the generic names and the brand names. It's confusing to doctors. There are multiple studies at the same time of comparable drugs for the same disease. So like different companies basically are running trials of what are called Me Too drugs. There'll be a PD-L1 inhibitor, a PD-1 inhibitor. Those are different kinds of inhibitors, by the way, and there are now like a dozen of those. There are very similar drugs, there are generic forms. And I think that the only way to keep up with all the data in real time will be with artificial intelligence. So if we could have artificial intelligence that we're constantly updating, scanning all the clinical trials, knowing the latest, including toxicity and what does not work, your doctor in the future, and really, I don't understand why this hasn't happened already, could at least get information about what is likely to help you or any other patient for that matter. Here are the drugs that are likely to work based on this particular features in the tumor, and that information should be available, in my opinion, to all oncologists and patients now, but it's not. And I think AI will be the way that happens. I don't think that there's any other way of achieving, sifting through, there are like 2 million cancer cases in the US a year. How much, and multiple biopsies of each, and so much molecular data. There's no way that humans can analyze all that.
But similarly, I think artificial intelligence can be of great help in terms of education. There's a big gap in how all of us understand the treatments we're going through, and then once we're done with treatments, the aftermath we're dealing with. And there is a shortage in how we're being educated and which sources to go to. And I think artificial intelligence can also triage there to some degree. Some of that, the AI bot can communicate with you, but can also triage you to say, I think at this point you need to go and get more help from this or that person, which is something we're grossly lacking at the current time and age. There's not enough resources.
Yeah, I mean, I see that. I would say as a patient, though, I prefer not to interact with AI. Like I know hospitals now where doctors are actually using AI or ChatGPT to write their notes and to communicate with patients. That really bothers me. I mean, I want my physicians to be humans. I may want to look at the resources, the data as sifted by AI, but I want a doctor to communicate with me, and I feel very strongly about that. Yeah.
So I think it's
just in one other point about all the information, I think that unfortunately a lot of doctors are not sufficiently educated in about genetics and genomics. And as I read in the book, and this, you know, how to make friends. I mean, I'm a fan of doctors being nice, and I like, you know, there's a lot of money now in medical humanities. Like you can get grants, and you know, in the medical humanities. So doctors write how it's important, and patients write too. You know, narrative medicine and all that. And I like to think, and I think I was, you know, you know, that I was nice to my patients, you know, and communicative. I always called them back. I mean, I really value doctors who are thoughtful, and who, I know in my own care, you know, if doctor's not compassionate and doesn't care about like the whole me, you know, I just can't, I struggle to deal with that. But I also want my doctors to know what they're talking about and what they're doing. And it's not just older oncologists, but unfortunately, you know, now to go to medical school, a lot of people can go through in 3 years, which in my opinion is not enough. And, you know, we're sort of the way that, because of the need for primary care doctors, which is real, I know well, we end up with physicians who have less training than I had. And I think that's unfortunate, because I think there's more than ever for doctors and for patients and geneticists and everyone to know about biology, molecular biology, genomics, immunology, all that. And so I think, you know, courses in medical ethics are crucial, that doctors need, and that doctors need to be effective communicators, but that you know, there has to be more focus on hard science in medical education. And that is not trendy. It's not a popular view among some of my peers, but I really believe it, because a lot of doctors, they just, you know, they get the test results and they don't know what to make of it. And this is going to get worse as we have more, you know, 10 years from now. You know, right now we have very few treatments that are effective for, say, brain cancer, and that's really unfortunate. And as I mentioned, pancreatic cancer, liver cancers. But as those, you know, as progress happens, there's going to be more data for doctors to absorb and evaluate, not just like repeat, but you want doctors to understand the data and the limits of findings, to understand how the trials compare. And that takes a lot of education in math and science. It's the reality. I don't think organic chemistry is so important, but statistics and biology, very, very important. Yeah.
But also a person's mind. I was involved in a study where we looked at the impact of a genomic test on deciding how somebody will be treated with cancer treatment. And what I looked at was the psychological impact of the test, which is enormous for both the provider and the patient. It puts an enormous stress because, yes, more data gives more data points, but also nothing is ever 100% certain. And so you also introduce more factors of uncertainty. And so it's fascinating how over the last 200 years, things have progressed very quickly. And it's only 200 years ago, if you think about it, 2 people's lifetimes. Can you imagine where we're going to be 100 years from now? It's amazing and important that we take a step back and pause and see, where do we want this to go? So that we're not putting the cart before the horse, but hopefully we're able to control things just a little bit more than we are at the current time. I wanted to look at the questions because Jonathan wrote down, I can tell you why, but I lost track of when he wrote this. I don't know what this refers to, Jonathan. Sorry.
Hi, Jonathan.
Sure. Hi, Elaine. Thank you so much for speaking to our group. It's been a very fascinating discussion. Just to let you know, I'm a PhD scientist in public health. I work in the School of Family Medicine at the University of Pittsburgh. And most of my work is in implementation science and quality improvement in primary care. I also coincidentally have metastatic colon cancer and am working through working while being sick. And even around a bunch of doctors, that's still hard to do. But I wanted to come back to your question about why AI hasn't been more prevalent in the medical community as we've seen it in the popular community. And we have a PhD data scientist in our team who's works on artificial intelligence problems. And one of my other colleagues runs a precision medicine clinic in UPMC as well. So I've been around a lot of these issues. And some of the common themes are, first of all, the data. Like if you imagine what it took to get ChatGPT to be able to understand natural language, you're talking about billions of language samples over hundreds of years that it ingested. And if you think about medical technology, most medical technology has been around for like a decade or two, or maybe 3 or 100 years, but certainly all of medical knowledge is emerging. So you don't have enough samples of data when it's sequestered across medical records. So like there might be 10 patients in our population who have some disease, but that's certainly not statistically appropriate. And our medical record company won't give up any data for any price. And they're all trying to play that bid of get enough data so that their models can work. Now, we as scientists can like request data and can get it, mess with it, but there's always a cap on how much we can get. We have like 850,000 patients in our network. If we were to get a significant portion of that, then we could identify those patients. So they won't let researchers have enough data really to, and we don't have procedures like glove box procedures for chemistry. We don't have glove box procedures for data at the moment. So you can't confidently share HIPAA records with anybody and not have them figure it out like when quantum computing becomes a thing or whatever. So everybody's paranoid.
Yeah.
So really the biggest reason, oh, and the other thing I wanted to point out too is our publication system is not ideal either. Authors are incentivized to have long tail studies, like you want to have something unique to publish, and that it may not be applicable to a whole lot of people. And if you do publish something that's applicable to a whole lot of people, often it's criticized as not being original enough, and so it gets, you know, squashed, or you have to pivot your analyses or whatever. So to get 100,000 examples of a quality population-based study on immunization would never happen, because we don't have 100 journals who would publish 100 articles. And then again, you look at how we publish the articles, the terminology is so complex and specific that to build up enough samples using those words is really challenging. So I believe we're going to get there eventually, but you're at the cutting edge of a lot of very complicated computer science problems that we can't throw data at like we did in the consumer world. The consumer world data is, you know, relatively cheap and available because everybody tracks everything that they do. But in the medical world, it's been much more difficult. So that's my answer.
Thank you, Jonathan. This is Elaine, you want to say something?
Well, yeah, I mean, first, Jonathan, I wish for you a full, a speedy recovery, or well, and I think I appreciate your perspective. I think it sounds very real, and I understand that. And I've heard it from people at other centers too, that, you know, the data are hard to collect, if you will. And just to add, to build on what you said, I'll speak to my experience dealing with the National Cancer Institute, which in principle could have the largest database about cancer statistics. And they have, you know, so as I go through in the book, actually, before 1973, there was no national cancer database. So there were some registries set up by doctors, like the Connecticut State Registry. The surgeons, American College of Surgeons, had a cancer registry, and they would follow their little groups of patients over time. But there was it was hard to get for statisticians to know what was the survival rate with acute leukemia in North America until after 1973 because there was no national database. Anyway, currently, now 50 years later, the SEER group of the National Cancer Institute collects data really, really slowly. So if you look at, for example, what I know best is the breast cancer survival data. If you look for the statistics for people who are living with stage 4 breast cancer, it's said that their median survival is under 3 years. However, if you talk with people at the NCI, you learn that it takes them 3 years to collect the data. And then what they're looking at is population-based data. Most people of the population who are known to have cancer or a particular stage of cancer are not getting the best treatments or the newest treatments. So, they don't have information on, well, if you get the new treatments, what's the 3-year survival? I mean, I have, unfortunately, friends and acquaintances through my work in advocacy who have died since I entered this field, if you will, of patient advocacy. But the fact is, I'm continually surprised by how many people I know who have stage 4 cancer who are living longer than they were supposed to. That gives me optimism, but it also, as I write, makes me worry for the people who are not accessing good care, because I think that the statistics belie progress, that they obscure the progress, if you will, because the statistics lag behind what people can get. If everyone were getting the right treatment, the statistics would, at the population level for survival with any cancer form, would be much better. And I'm very frustrated that even the National Cancer Institute can't provide, real-time statistics. I find that impossible. But what they describe are, medical records that are still text-based, that they, just different systems, privacy issues, etc. So those are very real problems. And they're not just about statistics. I mean, these influence decisions that people make. I mean, if you have stage 4, prostate cancer, say, and you read the statistics, you might say, you know what, I don't want to do this. It's not worth it. But then if you could see only the statistics that are applicable to people who got modern care, or what I consider to be modern care, they may not be perfect, but they probably would be better than the statistics that are published each year by the government. And I think that the group there, they're doing a great job. They worked really hard. It's just that they're limited in their access to data, and it takes them a while to collect the data carefully.
But to take it a step further, wait a minute, Jonathan. Yeah, I see your hand up. Some of this real-time data collection, I think, would also help insurance approvals of treatments that are not reachable for many patients at the current time and age. Jonathan, do you have your hand up? You want to ask another question?
Yeah, I was going to tell you the solution to that, and it's something that America will not accept likely, but it is a centralized, socialized system of medicine.
Yeah.
I was talking to a colleague from Norway, and he said, give me just a second. Our national immunization rate is 73%, and they know what vaccine everybody got. They send a nurse to your house with a vaccine if you haven't been vaccinated. Hey, can we get you vaccinated? And so, like, if you ask cancer statistics, they know who had it, who died, who lived, what they were on, how much it cost, and their cost effectiveness analyses are much better. They make better decisions with the money that they have because of that. I wish we could get to a closer to that.
Well,
Jonathan, the VA also, by the way, the VA here in the United States.
I mean, I share that view. I would just point out some interesting history that in the 1930s, the early Cancer Society was led by 2 physicians sequentially in Massachusetts who favored a national healthcare program. And they set up the earliest state-run cancer hospital was Pondville in Massachusetts. And the reason that the doctors in Massachusetts set up the the state institution and a network of clinics throughout Massachusetts to basically capture all the cancer patients. They basically wanted physicians to refer all their patients to the Pondville Hospital where they would get free care, was so that they could do research. And the research would be, there were a lot of consent issues. It's actually kind of scary what may have gone on there, but they wanted to know as much as they could about all the cancer patients in Massachusetts. And those two physicians had the position of favoring a national healthcare program, which at the time the American Medical Association opposed, as it still generally does. But they, some of the cancer experts were pioneers really in wanting basically government-run healthcare for purposes of research. And I found that very interesting. Yeah, of course, then cancer care was not lucrative. I mean, as I write, in the early cancer hospitals, they had to plead with patients for entry, and they got desperate patients. There was no money to be made in oncology. Now, it's a very lucrative field, and private hospitals are thriving, and people, as are these companies, which are separating the data from the community use, let's call it. Yeah.
Elaine, your book, an hour does not do justice to your book, and I think you have a lot of food for thought in terms of writing more. If everybody's okay with it, I was going to address the last two questions that were posted, meaning we're going a little bit over 7 o'clock, and then close it for the night. Is that okay with everybody? I understand if you have to leave, you have to leave.
Yeah, I understand too. Yeah, I appreciate your listening and
it's
questions.
very important stuff, and obviously everybody here thinks the same. Marianne is asking if your book explains how gene discoveries, such as for breast cancer, BRCA1 and 2, have helped cancer diagnoses evolve. And she's asking, what is that historical start versus where are we now?
Sure. Well, I think the big point there is how slowly science used to reach the clinics. So the breast cancer genes were identified, let's say the very early 90s. The HER2 molecule, which is the target of Herceptin and now other drugs, was discovered as a cancer-causing gene in the late 1980s. And it took, let's say for HER2, 10 years for trials in humans, and then another 5 to 10 years for the drug to be approved, and then only in very advanced cases of cancer. BRCA, the breast cancer genes, doctors were very skeptical about there being genetic or genomic causes of cancer. Actually, the Cancer Society and most of the experts in cancer through the 1960s basically disparaged the early geneticists. It's interesting, actually, of all things, that some of the tobacco companies through their organization funded some of the earliest genetic work on cancer. You know why? Because they were looking for causes of cancer that were not tobacco related. Anything that wasn't tobacco that caused cancer was good. So but anyway, the point is the mainstream cancer experts, for the most part, didn't believe that cancer was caused by genetic changes or even ran in families. That was controversial until the 1970s or 80s. So now and that was then the ability to sequence genes in the 80s, or really the 90s, to be able to do it rapidly, and to be able to clone, for example, monoclonal antibodies, which developed, the structure of monoclonal antibodies was discovered, I think, in 68 or 69. Cloning antibodies was in the 80s, but for drugs to enter the clinic didn't happen until the late 90s, early 2000s. The first genetic or genomic targeting drugs didn't happen until the past 12 years, say, more or less, with exception. My point is that it took a long time for scientific developments to reach the clinic. Now research can happen faster, and that's in part because of computers. And data analysis. And I believe, in my opinion, clinical trials can happen much faster thanks to AI and just the way that data can be analyzed. So it's sort of, in my view, that, and now, for example, when I was practicing, there was no such thing as triple negative breast cancer. There was hormone sensitive or not. That was in the 80s and early 90s. Then we started saying HER2, and we knew that was bad. Now HER2 diagnosis is good because there's so many drugs targeting that particular molecule. In fact, just today I saw a new publication, I think it was the Journal of Clinical Oncology, about HER2, a new anti-HER2 therapy in lung cancer, where some lung cancer cases have a lot of HER2, and you can use some of the breast cancer or the anti-HER2 drugs effectively in some cases of lung cancer, which is fantastic. I mean, we're starting to think of tumor in tissue agnostic ways, meaning what matters is the molecules in the tumor more than the place itself. It may be that both matters, the location of the tumor and the molecules. It's not simple, but I think all of this, you know, the science is evolving faster thanks to technology and communications, and, you know, including advances in computer science, which people don't talk about. Also advances in radiology. Yeah, so I think that the diagnoses will evolve, molecular diagnoses will evolve. People will say, I have, you know, ALK positive, HER2 negative prostate cancer in the future, or what, you know, I'm making that up. But the point is, as we get more and more granular in our understanding of cancer, the treatments will be more specific, and I believe will be more effective. Yeah, or have the potential to be so. I also think as people know that they have a bad form, if that happens, you know, one that we don't have treatments for, they may, you know, that may enable them to, you know, skip treatments that are unlikely to help them, or that may be too toxic without good reason. And that also is helpful. The fact that we can define tumors now that are less responsive is useful to people, so that people don't feel like they're throwing in the towel prematurely. They can know, unfortunately, there's nothing for this. Whereas, you know, they can learn as much as possible about their tumor. That's great.
And just one more clinical pearl, in terms of everybody who's done genetic testing in the past, for testing if they have a predisposition to developing cancer, that evolves very quickly, and most medical geneticists will say, if possible, go back every 5 years to that geneticist and see if it's worthwhile for your particular situation to evaluate whether you qualify for more genetic testing. These panels are growing in size and number, and so if every 5 years you touch base with the geneticist, they can tell you whether in your particular scenario it's worth doing more testing. Going to the last question, Andrea Jackman is still here, I think, and she asked, this is music to my PhD ears. She's a research engineer in meteorological hazards. There you are. And I'm wondering, she asks, what you found in your book research about communication of uncertainty, which we talked about earlier. Statistics can be wonderful tools, but only if you understand what the numbers mean. Correct? Elaine, would you feel comfortable?
Well, maybe I would say that so my book doesn't focus on statistics in any way. Really, it's not a science book. I didn't set out to write about technical or statistical aspects. And I think the greatest point here is that the statistics are constantly changing. And people should know that as a doctor, I was very comfortable speaking of uncertainty. And I think that style is preferred by some patients and not by others. So I remember there was an oncologist, one of my teachers, and he was like, you know, I went to see him with my father, who had a lymphoma. It was an aggressive. Anyway, he said, I know what you need, you know, and he was like very assertive and a little bit too, you know, he was very clear, and he had a very successful practice, as I did too, I should say. But we had different kinds of patients. You know, there are people who like doctors who will say, you know, we could go this way or we could go that. And well, I think there's several ways of looking at this, and I'm not sure, you know. And then there are other people who need a very confident sense of what's right. I mean, I think that a very confident person can admit uncertainty, but it's tricky, and there are some doctors who are reluctant to do that. I think also doctors are trained now to share statistics more with patients, which I think is really hard on patients. I mean, I just don't, in my own care, some of the complicated, I have a number of chronic conditions, and every once in a while, if I don't trust a doctor, I'll start Googling and doing my own research, but I prefer not to. I prefer to find a doctor I trust and go with their view and their sense of the statistics, because even statistics can be interpreted variously. I think there are different styles of doctoring, and there are different styles of patienting. I've never used that as a verb before, but yeah. So I think the best communication is honesty, and that includes if there's uncertainty. Yeah, that's where I am.
I think uncertainty is a key word for cancer survivors, for all of us human beings on the planet, but in particular as a cancer survivor, you're facing a lot of uncertainty about everything, including your survival. And so wanting to have some certainty and control, I think, is the elephant in the room. And I think that will be another nice topic to delve into for you, Elaine, because I think we human beings do a very bad job of dealing with that. And it's very, very hard, and we all have our own ways of dealing with it. But it would be nice historically how we've changed in terms of dealing with that. And I think, Elaine, this topic tonight, your book and your answers and your conversation with us were very, very valuable. This book for me was eye-opening, and I've worked in this field, so it's amazing how much I didn't know about the history of our field, in terms of how it evolved over time. And I thank you for spending time with us tonight. And I thank Cancer Bridges, Wendy and Jen, for allowing us to happen tonight, and for all of you to be here to turn it into a group activity. I really, really appreciate this conversation. And I thank all of you. I don't know if anybody else wants to say something to close it off.
I'll just say thank you for having me. I really have enjoyed hearing your questions, and really, I wrote this book with the intention of advocacy, because I think I wanted people to know that I think cancer in many cases is treatable. And so I thank you for your attention. And yeah.
I just want to thank both of you as well. It's wonderful to work again with you, Dr. Josie, to have you here. And then Elaine, what you're doing is phenomenal. As a social worker for 32 years working in oncology, having a physician that went through this and having your perspective is invaluable. So, and very hopeful. And that's kind of what I am. My vibe for counseling is, being a hopeful realist, right? You deal with the reality of things, and you look how we can face it and talk about it, and give people something that they can do when they feel like there's nothing that they have control over. So I think you give a lot of hope. So thank you.
Well, thank you all.
Thank
All right.
you.
Thank you very much.
All right.
Thank
Okay,
you.
take care. Okay, good night.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Thanks.
Thanks a lot.
You're welcome.